My brother was the golden child. His whole life. One secret changed everything. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from realizing that the story you have been living your entire life was never the true one. This is the story of a family that kept a secret for 34 years. A secret that shaped every dynamic, every decision, every wound, and every favoritism, and every moment of quiet injustice that one daughter spent her entire childhood trying to understand. And it is the story of a woman named Margaret, 71 years old, carrying 34 years of guilt, who finally picked up the phone. She called on a Wednesday morning in November. The woman who answered was named Claire. She was 36 years old. She was eating toast at her kitchen counter and getting ready for work. She had no idea that the next 4 minutes would reframe every single year of her life that had come before them. "I was your mother's closest friend," Margaret said, "and there is something I promised her I would never tell you. But she's been gone for 2 years now, and I can't carry it anymore." Claire put down her toast. "Your brother," Margaret said, "he isn't who your family says he is." To understand what Margaret's phone call meant, you have to understand what it meant to grow up in the shadow of Ryan. Ryan was 3 years older than Claire. From her earliest memories, he occupied a different quality of space in the family, more noticed, more celebrated, more carefully tended. Not in ways that were obvious to the outside world. Their parents were not cruel people. They did not openly favor one child over another in the way of bad fairy tales. It was subtler than that, and in some ways, more difficult to name. Ryan's school performances were celebrated with dinners out. Claire's were acknowledged with nods. Ryan's friends were welcomed into the house with warmth and extra food in the refrigerator. Claire's friends were politely tolerated. When Ryan struggled, with a difficult year at university, with a job loss in his late 20s, with the slow dissolution of his first marriage, the family gathered around him with the specific tenderness of people protecting something precious. When Claire struggled, she was reminded, gently but consistently, that she was capable and strong and would figure it out. She did figure it out. That was never in question. Claire was the kind of person who figured things out, who solved her own problems quietly, who didn't ask for more than she thought she'd receive, who had calibrated her needs downward to fit the space that was available to her. But the calibration had a cost. It always does. By the time Claire was an adult, she had a complicated relationship with her own needs, a tendency to minimize them, to preemptively excuse herself from rooms before she was asked to leave, to feel vaguely guilty for wanting things. She had worked on this in therapy. She understood where it came from. Understanding it and being free of it were different things. Her father had died when she was 24. A sudden heart attack, swift and without warning. The kind of death that leaves no time for the conversations that should have happened years earlier. Her mother, Patricia, had survived him by 14 years, dying 2 years before Margaret's phone call of a slow and difficult illness that Claire had managed largely alone, driving 3 hours each way every other weekend, while Ryan sent flowers and called on Sundays. Ryan had been the executor of the estate. Of course he had. He had handled it efficiently and, as far as Claire could tell, fairly. There had been no dramatic inheritance dispute, no contested will. The house had been sold, the proceeds split evenly. Claire had been grateful for that. It was more than she had expected, if she was honest. She was 34 when her mother died. She was 36 when Margaret called. The 2 years between had been quietly healing ones. Without her mother's illness to manage, without the every other weekend drives, Claire had found space she hadn't had in years. She had been promoted at work. She had started running. She had begun, slowly and with some difficulty, to let herself want things again. And then the phone rang. Margaret had been Patricia's closest friend for over 40 years. They had met as young mothers, their children the same ages, their houses on the same street, their lives running in parallel through the particular shared texture of early parenthood. Claire remembered Margaret from childhood as a constant presence, at birthday parties, at holiday gatherings, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the specific easy intimacy of two people who know each other's lives completely. After Patricia's death, Margaret had sent a card and called once. Claire had not thought much about the relative silence since. Grief reorganizes people's lives in different ways. On the Wednesday morning in November, Margaret's voice on the phone was steady, but carried something underneath it, a quality Claire would later describe as the sound of someone who has been rehearsing something for a very long time. "I need to tell you something about Ryan," Margaret said, "about where Ryan came from." Claire set her toast down. "What do you mean, where he came from?" "Your parents, your mother especially. She wanted so much to have children. You know, they tried for years before Ryan. What you don't know is how Ryan arrived." The story Margaret told was this. Patricia and Claire's father, George, had tried to conceive for 6 years before Ryan. 6 years of the specific quiet devastation of wanting something and being unable to have it, of treatments and disappointments, and the monthly grief that people who haven't experienced it often underestimate. By the time Patricia was 32, the doctors had told them the probability of a natural pregnancy was very low. A colleague of George's had a sister. The sister was 20 years old, unmarried and pregnant in circumstances that had left her unable to keep the child. It was 1981. These arrangements happened quietly, privately, outside the formal adoption system, more often than people acknowledged. George's colleague had approached him carefully, delicately, with the kind of offer that is extended between people who trust each other and understand that some things are not discussed outside the room. Patricia and George had taken the baby. They had moved to a new neighborhood 6 months before the birth, ostensibly because of George's job, a reason that had always been accepted without question. They had registered Ryan as their biological son. They had told no one except Margaret, who had been told in confidence 2 years after Ryan's birth, during a late night that had loosened something in Patricia that she had kept sealed too long. Margaret had listened. She had promised to keep the secret. And she had kept it for 34 years, through Patricia's illness, through the funeral, through 2 years of sitting with it alone. "I tried to honor what she asked of me," Margaret told Claire. "But she's gone now, and I've been watching you your whole life, Claire. I've watched what it cost you always being second, and I thought you deserved to know why." Claire stood at her kitchen counter for a long moment after the call ended. Then she called her office and said she wouldn't be in that day. The days that followed Margaret's call were among the strangest of Claire's life. She did not call Ryan immediately. She did not call anyone immediately. She needed time to sit with the information, to turn it over, to look at it from different angles, to understand what it meant and what it changed, and what, if anything, it explained. It explained a great deal. Not the favoritism itself, that, if anything, became more complicated to understand, not less. Because here was the thing that Claire kept returning to in those first days. Ryan hadn't known. He had grown up with the same stories she had. He had believed himself to be their biological son. The favoritism had not come from guilt about deceiving him specifically, or if it had, it was a guilt her parents had never articulated, even to themselves. What it had come from, Claire eventually came to believe, was something more primal and less conscious. Her parents had wanted Ryan so desperately for so long that when he arrived, however he arrived, he carried the weight of all that longing. He was the answer to 6 years of grief. He was the proof that their family was possible. And then Claire had come along 3 years later, naturally, easily, almost as an afterthought. The biological child they had stopped expecting. And she had arrived into a family that had already organized itself around someone else's centrality. She was loved. She had never doubted that exactly, but she had always been loved differently. And now she understood why. The understanding did not dissolve the pain. It gave it a shape. That was something, though not everything. Claire called a therapist she had seen years earlier. She told her what had happened. They scheduled 3 sessions in the following 2 weeks. In those sessions, Claire worked through something she had been carrying since childhood. The specific wound of always being slightly less, of always falling slightly short of a standard she could never quite identify. She had spent years wondering what was wrong with her. Now she understood that the question had always been pointed in the wrong direction. Nothing had been wrong with her. Something had been hidden from her. There was also the practical question of what to do with what she knew. She thought about saying nothing, absorbing it privately, integrating it into her own understanding of her life, letting it change her internally without disrupting anything externally. She could do that. She was good at absorbing things privately. She had been doing it her whole life. But the more she sat with it, the more that option felt like the same pattern she had always been in. The pattern of making herself smaller to protect other people's comfort. The pattern of swallowing things that deserve to be said. Ryan was 40 years old. He had a wife and 2 children. He was living a life built on a foundation he had not been told the truth about. He deserved to know. Not as an act of disruption, not as revenge for years of favoritism that he hadn't consciously chosen, but because the truth belonged to him. It was his story. His parents had taken it from him before he was old enough to want it. Claire decided she was going to give it back. She called Ryan on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Margaret's call. She asked if she could come and see him. Not a usual request, their relationship having settled into the cordial distance of siblings who share a history, but not a present. He said yes, with the slight wariness of someone who senses that an unusual request means unusual news. She drove the 2 hours to his house. His wife, Anna, was there when she arrived. Claire asked, as gently as she could, if she and Ryan could speak privately. Anna read the room and took their children to the park. They sat in Ryan's kitchen. Claire had thought carefully about how to begin. She had rehearsed it several times. In the end, she simply said, "He found something out 3 weeks ago that I think you need to know, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you because I believe you have a right to this, not because I want to hurt you." Ryan looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. She told him everything: Margaret's call, the story of the arrangement, the year, the circumstances, the colleague, the move to the new neighborhood. She told him as clearly and as carefully as she could, watching his face the entire time. Ryan did not react the way she had expected. She had prepared for anger, at her, at their parents, at the situation. She had prepared for disbelief, for denial, for the defensive response of someone who doesn't want the information they're receiving. What she had not prepared for was the stillness. Ryan sat across from her, and he went very still. The specific stillness of someone absorbing something so large that the body stops moving while the mind tries to find a place to put it. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. "How long have you known?" he asked. 3 weeks. "Why didn't you call me immediately?" "Because I needed to understand it myself first. Because I wanted to be able to sit with you and be present for it, not still in shock myself." He nodded slowly. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. "Does this change things for you?" he asked finally. "With us?" It was not the question she had expected. She had expected him to ask about their parents, about why they had kept it secret, about what it meant for his identity, his medical history, his sense of himself. But he had asked about her, about them. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think it explains some things. I think I needed to understand those things for my own sake, but I didn't come here to blame you for anything. You didn't choose any of this either." Something shifted in his face at that. They talked for 4 hours. Anna came home, understood something significant was happening, and quietly kept the children occupied. Claire and Ryan talked about their childhood, about moments neither of them had ever discussed, about the dynamics they had both perceived and interpreted differently. Ryan said things Claire had not known, that he had always felt a pressure he couldn't name, a sense of needing to justify his place in the family, a guilt about taking up space that he had never understood the source of. She had spent her life feeling too small. He had spent his feeling afraid of being too much. They had both been living inside the same secret without knowing it. Ryan chose to pursue information about his biological origins. That process, slow, emotional, and ultimately inconclusive in some respects, took the better part of a year. George's colleague had died. The sister, Ryan's biological mother, was located through a combination of records and persistence. She was 60 years old, living in another state, and had spent 4 decades not knowing what had become of the baby she had given up. That reunion was Ryan's story to tell, not Claire's. She was not present for it, but she was the first person he called afterward, and she sat on the phone with him for 2 hours while he processed what had happened And that felt like something new between them. A different kind of connection, built on honesty, rather than the careful distance that had characterized their adult relationship. The favoritism, when they talked about it directly, turned out to be something Ryan had noticed and felt complicated about for years, a discomfort he had buried under the general pressure of being the one the family pointed toward. He had not known its source. He had assumed it was simply who his parents were. Learning that it had roots in something specific, in the particular weight his arrival had carried, did not excuse it, but it recontextualized it in ways that allowed both of them to set it down a little. They did not become close overnight. That would have been too neat, too much like a resolution that real life rarely provides. What they became was more careful with each other, more honest, more willing to have the conversations that their family had never modeled for them. Claire called Margaret a month after the conversation with Ryan. She thanked her, genuinely, without reservation. Margaret cried. She said she had been afraid of what the information would do. Claire told her that the information had given her back something she had not known she was missing. An explanation that was true. She also told Margaret that she had been a good friend to Patricia, that keeping a secret for 34 years out of loyalty was not a small thing, that choosing to break it out of love for the person it had affected most was not a small thing either. Margaret said, "She was my dearest friend, but I watched you your whole life, Claire. I watched what it did to you. I should have told you sooner." "You told me when you could," Claire said. "That's enough." There is a particular kind of damage that secrets do to families. It is not always the damage you expect. Sometimes it is not the secret itself that causes the most harm. It is the shape the secret makes as the family moves around it, the distortions it creates in how people treat each other, the explanations that never come for things that deserved explaining. Patricia and George had not kept their secret out of malice. They had kept it out of fear. Fear of what Ryan would feel, fear of what others would think, fear of the questions that would follow an honest answer. They had believed they were protecting their family. What they had actually done was build the family on a foundation that couldn't bear the full weight of truth. And the cracks in that foundation had expressed themselves, over decades, in the particular way Claire had learned to make herself small, and in the particular way Ryan had learned to feel quietly undeserving of the space he occupied. Both of them had been shaped by something they hadn't been told. Claire thinks about this often now, about the things families pass down without naming them, the loyalties and wounds that travel from one generation to the next as behavior rather than information, as patterns rather than stories. She thinks about the conversations her parents could have had and didn't, the things they could have said and chose silence instead. She does not hate them for it. They were people of their time, doing what people of their time did with things that felt too large and too complicated for honesty. She grieves them differently now, with more understanding of who they actually were, rather than the simplified versions of them she had carried since childhood. But she also thinks about what it might have meant to grow up knowing the truth. To grow up in a family that had said, "Here is what happened. Here is where you both come from. Here is how much we wanted both of you and why. She thinks about the version of herself that might have existed in that family, a version who didn't spend decades wondering what was wrong with her, who didn't calibrate her needs downward, who took up her full amount of space from the beginning. That version of her didn't get to exist. But the version that did, the one who learned the truth at 36, who sat in her brother's kitchen for 4 hours and finally had the real conversation, is building something that version might have had from the start. It is slower, it is harder, but it is real, and it is entirely hers. Claire and Ryan have dinner together once a month now. They started this about a year after the conversation in his kitchen. A deliberate choice. The kind of thing that has to be chosen consciously when it wasn't built into the foundation. The dinners are not always easy. They are still learning how to be in the same room without the old dynamics rising up around them, still catching themselves sometimes in the familiar patterns, the old positions. But they catch themselves. That is something. Ryan's children call Claire their favorite aunt. She suspects this is partly because she brings better gifts than the other aunts, but she accepts the title regardless. She has a photograph of her parents on her desk at work. It is not the one she had before, the formal portrait from their anniversary, the one she had always kept out of obligation. It is a casual one she found in a box after her mother's death. Her parents at a barbecue, laughing at something outside the frame, young and unself-conscious and unaware of being photographed. She looks at it sometimes and she thinks, "You were afraid. You were trying to do right by your family and you were afraid. And you made choices that had consequences you didn't fully see." She understands that. She doesn't excuse it, but she understands it. Margaret came to visit last spring. They had lunch together, just the two of them for the first time as adults, without the context of Patricia between them. Margaret told stories Claire had never heard, about her mother as a young woman, before children, before the years of trying, before the weight of the secret, about who Patricia had been when she was simply herself. Claire listened to all of it. She is still learning who her family was. She expects she will be learning for a long time. But she is learning it now with the full story in her hands. And that makes all the difference.